Hello everyone and welcome to the Activist Lawyer podcast. My name is Sarah Henry and I'm your host to this podcast, which offers a platform for lawyers to share their story and their journey into law and activism. Our guests will discuss the challenges and highlights of their work, as well as important cases, opinions on legal and political matters, and will offer up advice and tips for anyone interested in pursuing a career in human rights law, public interest law, or criminal justice. The Activist Lawyer podcast is brought to you by the Granite Podcast Studio. Thank you so much for listening. Today, I am joined in the studio by Dr Ayesha Riaz from the University of Greenwich. Ayesha joins me. I actually met Ayesha recently enough at a conference in Glasgow, and I was fascinated by the research she shared, particularly around the legal aid system. So today's podcast really focuses on that, among other areas of research that people practicing in immigration and citizenship might find really interesting. But on the whole, it's interesting as well. We look at citizenship deprivation, the separation of powers around that, and also immigration detention and the provision of legal advice, which is still a very topical issue and a very important issue that needs to be addressed. So Ayesha, a bit of background, completed her PhD from Queen Mary University of London in 2025. So a lot of the research that we discussed today comes out of that research. And she also worked in practice at one of the largest legal aid firms in the UK, providing legal advice and assistance to people who were detained, non-detained asylum seekers, victims of domestic violence and victims of trafficking. So we talk a little bit about Ayesha's decision to go into academia following practice in a law firm. So her work has appeared in leading law journals and has been cited by the United Nations General Assembly and the House of Lords International Agreements Committee. So very interesting stuff, and I think it's valuable to kind of delve into some of these issues that we have touched on in the podcast previously, and we have indeed spoken to practitioners, whether solicitors or barristers, around the issue of legal aid. But I think it's really interesting to just ask why we're in this position where legal aid has become so challenging. And, you know, it is a crisis really across the UK. Ayesha speaks of legal aid deserts, where there are simply places and parts of the UK that aren't practicing and people have little to no access to justice, which puts them in an extremely precarious and vulnerable position. So I hope you enjoy today's episode. I really enjoyed recording this and will keep in touch with Ayesha around her work. And please check the show notes for links to her work. And as always, I'd like you to review and share the episode where possible. Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of The Activist Lawyer. It's a rainy, wet Saturday in Uri, but I am delighted to be joined by Dr Ayesha Riaz, who joins me. Where are you based at the moment?
I'm in London, UK, London, England.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining me today.
It's raining here as well.
It's just a wet June. Hopefully our summer isn't gone. I know you had horrific heat for the last few weeks in London. We had a little bit here. It was lovely actually, but yeah.
It was horrific here.
Well, Dr Ayesha Riaz, thank you for joining me, as I said. And we have met before. We met a number of weeks back at a conference where I heard you present around primarily legal aid, and it kind of threw up lots of questions for me. There was a lot of discussion about your presentation because this is an issue that really matters. And we are going to go into the detail of your research, your findings, and indeed your thoughts on the legal aid system. But before we do that, I'd like to go back in time a little bit and ask you about your journey into law and practice, because I know you worked in a law firm before, and also academia and your choice to go into academia.
Sure. So journey into law was a bit, how can I put it? So I never really had any idea about what I wanted to do when I was a student. So it was just by chance. I mean, I was just having a discussion with my dad, who thought I would be, suitable for this field. So he thought maybe, given how I fight cases at home, like, just trivial small cases against companies and stuff, he thought maybe, standing up for people's rights, maybe that would suit me. So that's when I decided to study law. So then I went to University of East London and I studied law there for 3 years. I enjoyed it a lot. It was very intensive. It was really, really intensive, yeah, I mean, doing 6 modules in a year, having exams, coursework.
Yeah.
But I think that was great. It got me ready for real life. I think
Yeah.
so. I was happy that it was very difficult, the syllabus and the studies. And then I started to do the bar. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. Then I did the bar. And then after the bar, I started working at a legal aid firm. So after a few years, I think I was doing some other work, and in between, and then finally I got a job at a legal aid firm in the UK. Actually, before I started working before I got the job, actually, I did some work experience at that firm.
Mm-hmm.
And so I spent a few weeks at the firm, and a few months later, they called me back and they said, we would like to offer you a job. So I was really, really happy. And it was in the immigration team. So it just so happened immigration and asylum team. So it was great. And then they put me in the asylum team, specific immigration, detention and asylum team. My job was really to help out asylum seekers and to go to detention centers and help out immigration detainees. In order to do this, you have to in order to work into legal aid, in the immigration sector and legal aid, immigration and asylum sector and legal aid, you have to sit some exams. They were called the immigration and IAAS exams. They were really, really tough. So you could be accredited. So I was first accredited at level 1, which meant I could do basic work for clients. And then I was accredited at level 2, which meant I could help out with bail, go to tribunals, help out with, many things. So basically I was a caseworker, but I could do many things that solicitors could do under the supervision of my supervising solicitor who I was working under. So I spent about 7.5 years there. But because I was working in legal aid, the pay was really, really poor.
Yeah.
So it was very difficult to survive on that poor pay. So I went back to East London, University of East London. I spoke to the head of department, and I said I'd really like to do some part-time teaching. And then, I was very fortunate in the sense that there was an opening. So I got into part-time teaching or visiting lectureship. So whilst I was working at the law firm, a few years later, I also started doing some teaching East London. And then, so I was working part-time at the law firm, and I was doing some visiting lectureship at East London. And then after a few years, I started working as a part-time teacher at LSE. So I was doing 3 jobs basically just to survive.
Gosh.
Yeah, so it's a bit bleak. And then finally in 2019, I started my PhD at Queen Mary. At that time, just before I started my PhD, I was also working at the University of Greenwich. So there was a time when I was doing 4 jobs.
4 jobs. That's insane.
And then, yes. And then after that, so there was a job opening at University of Greenwich in 2020. And I applied for the job. I got the job. And that's when I transitioned fully into academia. So I was working in the law firm from 2012 to 2019. Wow. And then I decided to do a PhD on the area that I was really frustrated with, but because of the
legal aid
system.
Yeah. So you've had experience both as a practitioner, and then obviously you were working in kind of the early part of your career with extremely vulnerable individuals, asylum seekers, victims of trafficking, survivors of domestic abuse. So how did those experiences, I suppose, shape the kind of path that you went on and, the realities of the legal system? So you also had an experience as a practitioner, but how did dealing with people who were in a very vulnerable position and going through the legal aid system help form your decision?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think that really formed the crux of my PhD studies. When I met my PhD supervisor for the very first time, she said, look, this is an area that you specialize in. And at the time I started my PhD, there was hardly anything on it, legal aid for asylum seekers. She said, why don't you, do a PhD on this area? You know this quite well because of your practical experience. And there was a lot of problem in this area, so it would make for a good PhD. So that's when I decided to focus on this area. And whilst working, I think the second thing I would like to say is that whilst working within that field, I felt like because of the way the legal aid system worked, you couldn't really help your clients. to the best of your abilities, because the legal aid system, number one, as you said, the pay is really poor. Number two, it is very bureaucratic, because the legal aid agency is an agency that pays legal aid firms. It is, it pays all those firms. So it wants to know how you've spent the money, but it really, really, really wants to know how you've spent their money. Yeah. So a lot of the time you end up, replying to their emails, which is fine. But to the extent that you find it very difficult to work on your clients' cases because there are only a few hours in a day.
Exactly. Which is why a lot of people and it's a crisis really that we've experienced here in the north. I know there's been some slight modifications and improvements, and solicitors here have been very active in speaking up for improved legal aid services and pay. But I do know that some people left practice because of that very reason, and also because their firms are recognising the difficulty in, sustainability as well when it comes to practice in immigration. So they often will ask or suggest or make lawyers who are working in immigration to do other areas as well. So, for example, maybe some more corporate stuff or employment. But again, immigration is so challenging in itself. And I think deliberately, well, I don't think I'm coming up with anything new here, but deliberately set up that it's extremely intense. And I feel like, people are being pushed to a limit now in many cases from what I'm hearing because of this. So, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes, it is. I mean, it's a real shame. It's hard to survive just by doing legal aid work. So a lot of lawyers nowadays do corporate immigration at the same time.
Which is tough.
Just to make
it's tough.
Which is tough. Yeah.
But we'll revisit the findings, because I was so fascinated particularly about the history of legal aid. I don't know. I never thought I would be very interested in that, but actually the way you presented it when I saw you in Glasgow at a conference, it was fantastic. But just before we get into that, I'd like to talk about some of your other work, which includes citizenship deprivation. And of course, the case that we might associate primarily with that would be the case of Shamima Begum, which many of our listeners will be familiar with. But I know you had written about this case in the Modern Law Review, and in relation to the expanding powers of the Secretary of State to deprive individuals of British citizenship. So I think you looked at that kind of balance between, the litigation and also the separation of powers issue as well. So for listeners who might not be all that familiar with the case, can you explain why the decision matters? And what does it tell us about this relationship between citizenship, getting that security balance right, and also executive power?
Sure. I mean, that's really good. I mean, question. So this was a case note I wrote like you said, for the Modern Law Review a few years ago. But, I thought the Shamima Begum case is, more than just about Shamima Begum, is a very big issue. It's a much bigger case about who gets to decide questions of citizenship, and also questions of national security in the UK. Yeah. That's what I gathered from the decision of the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court essentially said is that when there's national security issues are involved, the courts should give a lot of weight to the Home Secretary's judgment. And what this essentially means is that the executive branch of the state has a very strong role in deciding whether someone can be deprived of their citizenship. So, but what interested me about this case is that it shows how citizenship is being increasingly tied to, security concerns. Traditionally, if you look at citizenship, how it's evolved, it was seen as a very secure legal status, traditionally. But this Begum case suggests that, in some situations, citizenship can be removed. Yeah. If the government thinks it's necessary for national security. And then also this case raises, very important questions about accountability and fairness. So in the sense that if someone loses their citizenship and is outside the UK, how can they challenge the decision? Someone like Shamima Begum, so it's this case, sits at the heart of, when you look at citizenship, security, executive power, and the balance is, this case particularly shows is that it's being shifted increasingly towards the executive, that balance of power.
I think that was clear. And you do reference citizens of nowhere, which I think is a very good description of this, because of course we're looking at the whole concept of statelessness. That didn't apply in her case. But are there many people, did you discover in your research, or have you heard about many people who are in a similar position, who perhaps were minors at the time and then, you know, follow in a kind of similar path to what had happened here?
Yes, I think there are quite a few people who are stuck in this limbo, similar to Shamima Begum, you know, went as minors and they're stuck in that Al Roj camp. I believe that's where she is. So I'm not sure where everybody is located, but
yes, but as you say, it throws up so much in terms of that kind of balance and separation of powers. But yeah, no, really, really interesting. And I know another part of your work was to examine legal advice itself, particularly within the setting of immigration detention, which we know has been problematic from day one. And that includes, you've looked at kind of, I suppose, reimagining detention centres in England and how they should operate. So what did you come across in your research, apart from just the poor quality of legal advice? What issues did you encounter? And can you say a little bit more about what you find?
Yes, so just to give a little bit of context about this, in England, the government, you know, there's always been a shortage of immigration advisors, legal aid immigration and asylum advisors, especially in detention, especially when it comes to detention. Before 2018, there were just 4 or 5 firms that had legal aid contracts to do, you know, legal aid surgeries in detention, you know, immigration detention. But after 2018, what the legal aid agency did is that it allowed a lot of like legal aid providers to do immigration detention work. But many of them had very little experience of doing detention work. And like you said a few minutes ago, when you're looking at detention, you know, a lot of the clients that you'll deal with tend to be very, very vulnerable, you know. Very vulnerable, who may have spent maybe years traveling to the UK, and you know, and so what I found was that, you know, expanding access to providers with not enough experience was a highly problematic issue. You know, what I found is that there was always issues with poor quality legal advice, but this had raised exponentially, you know, afterwards. And detainees basically, you know, they had difficulties seeing their lawyers and stuff. So they were also not being provided with interpreters, you know, so how can you communicate with your lawyer if you're not given an interpreter? They were still, you know, despite expanding, you know, access to a lot of firms, legal aid access, you know, to a lot of firms, there were still delays in receiving advice. And many... and what happened as a result of that is that, you know, many of the detainees were still not getting advice on immigration bail, which is like, you know, the right to liberty. It's such an important right. So another issue I found was that, you know, monitoring the quality advice was not very effective as well. You know, so monitoring the quality of advice given was not effective, because if the lawyer didn't open a file, you couldn't assess what kind of advice that person gave. So, you know, I mean, when you're dealing with a very complex area of law, you know, you really need to think through some of the decisions you make at the higher levels, the legal aid agency, Ministry of Justice. But sometimes the decisions tend to be very erratic, and it leads to, you know, it just compounds the problem even more. So.
Yeah, that's horrific. And what, I suppose from your findings and also your research and just your thoughts, how would reform look? What could be improved?
Yeah, so, you know, if I was reforming the system, so, you know, just based on my article on the findings, I would say it's more about, you know, you look at quality rather than quantity. So look at the quality advice, you know, just because you increase the number of legal aid advisors, you know, it's not enough, you know. You need to go beyond that, you know, of course, and you can't just increase the number of providers just on a whim, you know. You have to think through things. So what I would do, so there's a few things, 4 or 5 things that I would suggest. So firstly, you know, it's to do with advice. So providers, legal aid providers that are undertaking detention work, you know, they're given proper specialist training, you know, and they have, you know, they have some experience of doing immigration detention work, you know, because of the vulnerability of the clients that you deal with in detention. Secondly, you know, quality control needs to be better. So, what the best way of measuring quality of advice given is through the peer review system. That was introduced in the early 2000s, but what happens as a result of that is that, when your file is reviewed by another lawyer or another caseworker or whatever, not by a civil servant in the legal aid agency. So your peer is reviewing files, so that would make the system much stronger, much more effective. So another problem you have with this system of detention is that, what tends to happen in detention is you would go and see firstly, you would do something called the surgery. So where every legal aid firm gets different surgery slots. So, and in those, during that surgery, you would see a maximum of, I think it is 10 clients, I think. If I remember correctly, and you get 30 minutes per client. That's not enough,
Wow.
The client so you need to give more time, to
That's
lawyers
an obvious
with their detainees.
one. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So, 30 minutes, and then whilst you are, doing that surgery with the client, we're sitting face to face. You also need to get an interpreter on the phone. You also need to go through the legal aid forms with them, so that takes up maybe 20 minutes. So 10 minutes. So finally, the most important one would be improving funding.
Yes.
The government recently has improved funding a little bit, in 2025, from 2007 until December 2025. Legal aid, so immigration and asylum legal aid advisors and lawyers didn't get a pay rise from the legal aid agency.
Yeah.
In fact, in 2012, it went down by 10%. So, yeah, I mean, in December 2025, they did decide to increase the fees by about 30%, maximum of 30% for legal aid, immigration and asylum advisors and lawyers. So, but that's not enough, it should be increased, every year. This is a main problem, funding. If you want high quality representation, you need to invest in people providing it, so so I think that would be,
I'm just thinking, what would the motive be to encourage that? Do you want higher quality representation? It feels like that's never been on the agenda because it's been so poor. And as you said, it's a very complex area of work. You've so many plates to spin at the same time. You've mentioned interpreters, the admin involved in filling out legal aid forms. It feels like it just has never been given the due regard that it deserves. And is that because we're dealing with immigration clients? It just seems to be a system that really is almost doomed to fail without being very pessimistic. But anybody I know working in the area struggle. They do.
Absolutely. It is a big struggle. And, I think it's not just, the pay, it's also the bureaucracy of it,
It's the time that takes as well. And then it doesn't make any sense. A lot of it is nonsensical and not necessary. But
absolutely.
Yeah. So as you said, there's been some improvements of late in terms of finance. It's not enough. The system needs to be reviewed as well. And that's probably why, I'm guessing, you entitled one of your pieces Strangled by Reform, which is really captures a lot of what we're talking about here. I did mention at the beginning that I liked how you took audience through the history of legal aid. And I think is it from 1949 that you start right up until 2024. So if you can, and this is a big ask, I appreciate, can you just take us on a whistle stop kind of tour between the kind of setup of legal aid, which wasn't too bad at the start from what I can gather, to where we're at now, or 2024, whenever your research finished?
Yes, absolutely. You're right there. I mean, when it started, why did I choose 1949? Because that's when, we had the Legal Aid and Advice Act formally, so legal aid system formally started after the Second World War, so around that time. So, it was very much like a post-war welfare state thing that was introduced, and a part of it was the legal aid system. So when it was, when the whole legal aid system started, it wasn't that bad, actually. I mean, I tried to find solicitors from the 60s. It was very difficult, but I managed to find somebody from 1969, and she said that was like, the golden age. That's what I said right in the article. So, the profession enjoyed a very high degree of trust, because the profession at that time, so of course Parliament authorized legal aid payments and stuff, but the profession was in charge of itself. It wasn't the civil service. It wasn't the Ministry of Justice. It wasn't the Legal Aid Agency. It wasn't the Legal Services Commission. It wasn't the Legal Aid Board. It was the Law Society. At that time, if you're being administered by your profession, there's going to be a high degree of trust. So, if you look at the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, 70s, and the 80s, 70s, 80s was when the problem started emerging. So, but, yeah, I mean, those were the good old days, as one of my interviewees said. But, things started changing in the 1970s and 80s during Margaret Thatcher's eras. So the neoliberal rise and neoliberalism and stuff. So at that time as well, you had an increase in the number of asylum seekers, which meant that a lot of legal aid was being used for asylum seekers and stuff. But, at the same time, legal aid, basically payments, legal aid system became more expensive. But, and in the 1980s is when, administration shifted from the Law Society to the Legal Aid Board, which meant that the Lord Chancellor's Department was now in charge of administering the legal aid system. And that's when the audits started, not on the same scale as they are now, but even then, one of the interviewers who I spoke to was practicing them. They said, actually, yes, the government did have oversight of what we did, but the government did, to an extent, trust us as well. They've respected our autonomy. So, things did gradually start to change with the rise in audits, with the start of audits. And then in the 1980s, there was a lot of asylum seekers entering the UK from different parts of the world. And that's when this area became highly politicized.
Yes.
When you hear these terms like lefty lawyers, it's actually not new. It's actually started a very long time ago. And then 1990s and 2000s was just horrific, where you had the Legal Services Commission now. So we went from the Law Society being in charge, the profession being in charge, to the Legal Aid Board, to now the Legal Services Commission, which which was really, really quite bad. And that's, if you look at the Tony Blair era, he introduced, quite a few reforms to the legal aid system. Because the legal aid system had become expensive, he hired somebody called Lord Carter to review the legal aid system. And that's when all the auditing was, ramped up, micromanagement, all the KPIs, key performance indicators were set up, immigration, asylum, lawyers had to do exams, illegal aid immigration and asylum lawyers, and also the private ones as well. There was a lot of accountability and cost control.
Highly politicized, obviously, and attached to political decisions solely.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And that's when they had the fixed fee as well. So 2007, before 2007, you could charge, on the hourly rate system, which meant you could charge for your time and ask for extensions. But after that, they said, the most you will get is about 400 and something pounds per case, asylum case.
Yeah.
So, and unless you go make it exceptional, which is very difficult to do, go 3 times over 413. So if you make about £800 on a file, you can only charge 413.
Exactly.
So,
and isn't
something like 400. And when you're looking at these, individuals who are working in these firms, they have very high targets.
Yeah.
It's very, very high targets that they have to meet 3 times their salary or whatever. So. And then it was the main changes came after, LASPO, Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act 2012. At least before 2012, you were getting maybe £450 per case, but then they've reduced that by 10%, which meant you could only get £413 per asylum case.
Outrageous.
So that meant it was very difficult to survive. A lot of areas of law were taken out of scope of legal aid. Asylum remained in scope.
Yeah.
But what that did is it meant that a lot of firms went bust. They had to close down.
Of course.
So now you have very few that do immigration and asylum work. And that's why you have legal aid deserts in many parts of England. Yeah. So, this is it's just a whistle tour of how things from being okay to really bad. And now this is where we are.
And influenced primarily, as we said, by political decisions and whoever's in power at the time. But the danger there is as well, people who are passionate about this work and genuinely want to do it as a career and want to help people. I mean, unsurprisingly, this could put them off. I mean, people need to live. Firms and business owners need to be able to sustain their practice, pay their staff. And, so you can see the difficulties. But I do feel like people do get creative around it, which is why, you know, you will see now even younger lawyers that we meet in here, they will do asylum and immigration, but they will also do the kind of corporate work to balance out the fees. And I don't know whether that's, I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but I feel like the system is still very much broken. And, you know, it's a real problem with access to justice. It's a real problem with the rule of law, I feel, because there is this overarching political decisions that are impacting how people are able to access even standard advice in many places. Here, it's just people are unable to find support in very many cases. The solicitors who are working in it are completely overwhelmed, you know.
Yes, I mean,
so
it's the next generation of lawyers. Yeah, I mean, there are so many that, you know, despite all the hardships, that want to help this section of society.
But there are people there, there's good kind of collective voices who are actively campaigning for this. And if this is something that you want to, an area that you want to work in, get involved, network with people who are leading the way in this across the UK. And, you know, there is support available, there's training. So if you're still enthusiastic about this area, still get involved. It's very fulfilling. It's very rewarding. You're meeting people from all over the world. And although it's tough and challenging, people continue to do it because of the fact that, you know, it's needed. It's a very pressurized area, but I think it's something that we like to kind of highlight in your piece, Strangled by Reform, which is an excellent name for it. So all of these reforms over the last number of decades have left us still in a very, very difficult space. So what would you do in terms of changing this system? What kind of would you, that's such a massive question. But just, you know, even if some kind of modest improvements might make things a little bit easier. We did talk about funding there, which is a very obvious point. But my concern is the impact that this has on vulnerable communities and, you know, them accessing justice as well as the profession itself.
Yes, I mean, absolutely. The first topmost priority would be increasing remuneration, but that too on a yearly basis. You know, index rate, that's what I think is the technical financial term for it or something. I'm not sure. And then also this unnecessary burden, you know, the fact that you should be answerable to your funders, but to a certain degree, not to the extent that, you know, where you go to a detention center and it takes you half an hour extra. And then they ask for about, you know, 10 pages of justification why it took you half an hour extra, or they send you 10 emails about why it took you half an hour extra to get to the detention center. You know, so this lack of trust, isn't it? And it seems like your funders are, you know, there's no longer that harmonious relationship with your funders. That used to be the case, you know, several decades ago when the profession, I also feel like the profession, maybe the law society, maybe, you know, it should take charge, you know, rather than giving it to all of these civil servants like, you know, the Legal Aid Agency, the Ministry of Justice, Law Chancellor's Department. Why don't you just make the profession in charge? And the profession maybe needs to have greater oversight of how the money is being spent, because, I mean, in those days when I was, so just going back to the history of legal aid, you know, in the 1970s, they had something called the Green Form Scheme. So it wasn't like the legal aid form that you have to fill in now. So you had this Green Form Scheme and you would get about £50 per case. If you needed an extension, the Law Society would grant it very easily. They said some of the solicitors that I spoke to who were practicing them, they said we would ring them up and they would say, yes, it's fine. Or we'd ring them up, or we do like a paper application, small paper application, not the ones that you have to do these days. And then you could get up to, you know, certain thousands of pounds to interview witnesses abroad. So there was that trust. But maybe the profession should have greater oversight as to how the money is being used if the profession's made in charge of the legal aid system. But I think that would be my topmost priority. Give it to the profession than the civil servants.
Interesting. Yeah. No, it definitely makes sense. Well, look, if anybody, we will be sharing links to your work on the show notes to this because it's fascinating, and I'm sure anybody working in this will have their own opinion on it as well. But just looking ahead, how can anybody find out more about your work, and what are you currently working on, and what's going on in the future in terms of your work?
Sure, yeah. So my work, I think I'm not really on LinkedIn or which is really bad or anything. But if you Google me, and then I'm going to try to update, you know, where I work. So University of Greenwich. So I've updated the article list after many years. So I'll try to update it as and when I can. Good. I mean, it's still if you Google me and if you look at my publication list, or if you go onto my ORCID ID, that has all my publications. That's updated automatically, ORCID. So ORCID. If you Google me and you get to my ORCID ID.
Brilliant.
Or if you have access to Westlaw and you type my name in the author, you will find a few articles there as well. So by all means, or if you want to reach out to me, you can email me as well at a.riaz@gre.ac.uk. I can send you accepted versions of my articles.
That's brilliant.
Thank you. And the plans for the future. So at the moment, I'm working on a few different articles. One is about something different from legal aid. It's about the Refugee Convention and protection of women.
Brilliant.
So how that's changed as well, because I've looked at a number of decisions. So that's more of a doctrinal piece of work, not empirical like I would do interviews. It's more doctrinal. So here I looked at how the UK used to follow certain cases like the Acosta case or the Ward case when it comes to a particular social group, but how the Nationality and Borders Act has made things a lot more difficult for the protection of women. So that's one of the articles I'm working on is being reviewed as we speak, peer reviewed as we speak. The other one I'm working on is I'm rewriting a case. It's from 2013 case. It's a good scene case from a feminist perspective. Brilliant. Although legal aid was granted, but feminism, so things like domestic violence, motherhood, that was overlooked in the decision. So I'm rewriting that Court of Appeal decision from a feminist perspective. So I will send you the link when that comes out. I think that's going to be Thank you. And then one of the other ones that I'm working on that's been pending is they're trying to find reviewers for my article is the Rwanda article. So it's on Rwanda and autocracy and autocratic governments and the Rwanda thing. So this is part of an issue that we some colleagues from Europe, some colleagues from America, they've got their own examples as well. So, but that's in the pipeline. That's been there for a few months. So we are trying to find reviewers since September. Haven't been able to find 2 reviewers. Oh, wow. I'm not sure what's happening with that. So and then the last thing I would say is I'm currently going to write a book on my PhD on the base. So this would be on how legal aid, so it's so the timelines will be extended to the current period, so probably go up to 2027, but it looks at legal aid and ethical obligations of publicly funded asylum lawyers from 1949 to 2027. So here I look at the legal aid system, and I also look at I also read, as part of the PhD, I also read all of the ethical obligations from the very beginning to like the current period and all the Hansard discussions. So trying to work on my monograph. Thank you.
So you've your hands full. But yes, please send us on any links to your work whenever those pieces are complete. And I will be sharing links to the site where your articles are published as well. And for anybody interested in this, please have a read. It's really fascinating stuff. And I'm really grateful to you, Dr. Ayesha Riaz, for joining me today in the studio. And let's keep in touch around your work.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure to be able to speak about my work.
Bye. Thanks everyone for joining me today. If you like the show, please remember to share and leave a review if you have a moment. And you can also check out our website, www.activistlawyer.com, where you will see some blog articles written by our guests and contributors, as well as some fabulous Activist Lawyer merchandise.
This podcast was recorded in Granite Podcast Studio. Interested in starting up your own podcast but don't know how? Granite Podcast Studio can help. Record your podcast in our state-of-the-art studio, which is based in the heart of Newry City. Our studio has cutting-edge and user-friendly technology and can seat up to 4 people. We also provide an editing service for our team using your guidance and editing notes to provide you with a flawless finished product, leaving your listeners wanting more. For more information on how you can get started, visit www.granitepodcaststudio.com.